So just so you know, I did just start the recording. So if you don't want to be seen, turn off your camera. Otherwise, the video will go up on YouTube eventually. I did just post the presentation from last month on YouTube, and there's a slide about that coming up. But just to let you know, we do have some upcoming presentations. March 15th, there will be a talk on Aplumado falcon conservation, primarily in South Texas. That'll be given by someone from the Peregrine Fund. April 19th will be some of the people from Texas Parks and Wildlife who are running the City Nature Challenge. And so we'll talk more about that. And then in May, we're going to have Star talk about bird photography. So I know there was a couple questions about cameras and stuff like that for this presentation, and we decided that's too big of a topic to add into everything else. So we split it off to its own presentation that'll be happening in a couple months. Okay, so today what we're going to do is talk about some of the tools that are really helpful for bird watching, for identification, for general enjoyment of birds. I'm Kevin Floyd, as most of you probably have seen, and I'm a member of the El Paso Audubon Society board. So this is more or less part 2 of our introduction to bird watching series. Last month we talked about bird identification and really went through the 12 steps, the 12-step program that come from this Peterson guide for bird identification. Like I mentioned, there is a recording on our YouTube page. The link was really, difficult to look at. So if you just search for El Paso Audubon Society, you'll find us if you are so inclined to watch me talk for another hour at the end of this. But today what we're going to be talking about are the tools that help you as you try to identify the birds. So the first part is going to be looking at how do you see the birds or get good looks at the birds. So thinking about optics, focusing primarily on binoculars, but a little bit about spotting scopes as well. And then looking at sources of information. So talking about field guides, smartphone apps, and just real briefly some of the websites. So first thing, we're doing this as a binoculars 101. So when you think about binocular parts, it's really important to know the names of some of these. The couple pieces that are going to be important, you have the objective lens, that's the bigger lens at the bottom. You have the ocular lens or the eyepieces here at the top. There's a focus knob somewhere located usually central to the binoculars. And so you look through this end, you look through to the other end. Now, what's important about that is thinking about the type of light that comes into the binoculars. So there's a little bit of physics involved that we're not going to go through, but typically for birding binoculars, people recommend somewhere between a 7 times magnification and a 10 times magnification, typically called a 7x up to a 10x. Often people really like 7 and 8. It's a little bit less magnification, but it also gives you a bigger field of view so you can see more of the area that you're looking at. And it also doesn't magnify the shake quite as much. So if you tend to have a little bit of instability, the higher magnification will tend to lead to a little bit, it'll magnify that shake as well and make it a little hard to see. The lens diameter, so thinking about that objective lens, you typically want to find something that's around 5 times greater than the magnification. And the reason for that is all about light. What we're trying to do is get as much light as possible coming into the objective lens, being focused through different prisms, and then coming out the eyepiece in as clear an image as possible. What you're looking for with that 5 times rule of thumb is something like an 8x42, a 10x42, or a 10x50. The more common are certainly these 42. And what the numbers mean, the 8 or the 10 is the magnification. So that's how many times larger you're going to see the object than you would with your naked eye. The 42 or the 50 refers to the diameter of this objective lens. So the bigger the number, the bigger that opening is going to be. The bigger the opening, the more light you're going to get in. A lot of times people, especially when they're first starting, they go for inexpensive binoculars, which makes sense if you're just starting. And you get little things like these little pocket binoculars. They're usually pretty inexpensive, but if you look, this one has a 12 times magnification and only 25 millimeter opening. So it's got a lot of magnification, but not much light. Binoculars like this are going to be challenging to use, particularly under challenging conditions. So if you're working at noon, sunny day, broad daylight, birds perched out in the open, something like the 10 by 25, these little pocket binoculars might actually work pretty well. But as soon as you start getting into low light situations, dawn or dusk, or a cloudy day, or a bird that's under a bush, that lack of light that can make it through the opening is going to be a big problem. So you really want something that's a little bit bigger. That being said, there are some really good pocket binoculars made by some really good companies that are, $700–800 binoculars that I'm sure are great. But certainly, as a general rule of thumb, something like an 8 by 42 or a 10 by 42 is a good way to go. One of the reasons that people are going to tend towards these smaller binoculars is this other important part, which is looking at the weight of the binoculars and the feel. So bigger binoculars, heavier binoculars can cause a lot of neck strain, particularly if you're sitting there holding the binoculars up to your eyes for a long time. If you go birding in the spring or fall, you'll experience something called warbler neck, which is basically trying to sit there staring up in the tops of the trees, looking for the little birds that are flitting around. If you're working with heavier binoculars, you have to hold that weight up for a longer time period, and it can really start to strain. So typically lighter binoculars are better. So when you start looking at some of the guides of binoculars, you will see weight as an important feature. Some of the challenges, though, is that typically lighter binoculars are either going to be less durable because they're made with plastic instead of metal, or they're going to be more expensive because they get that lightweight by using things like carbon fiber or more advanced materials. But it's definitely something you want to think about as you're looking at binoculars. The other part of this is just the feel, and it's something that there isn't really great advice for because it really depends on you and your hands and how you feel things. So my binoculars right here, these are Nikon Monarchs, and they work pretty well. You want to be able to see, does your finger hit the focus knob? Does it fit in your hand well? Does it feel balanced? When you adjust things, so this is a piece that a lot of people that are new to binoculars or borrowing binoculars don't realize, they actually flex. So if you can see there, they have a hinge that flexes, and it allows you to adjust the distance between the pupils, the interpupil distance, to the point that matches up with your eyes. So can you adjust, if you're looking at binoculars, can you adjust them to where you can look directly through them and get a single clear circle? Some binoculars just don't work for certain people. You might have excellent top-of-the-line binoculars, but they just don't feel right. They just don't fit. So you do want to make sure you can try them as much as possible. And I'll mention that later, how to try things out. So lighter, things that feel good to you are important to consider. A couple other features that I think a lot of people don't mess with when they're looking at binoculars or using binoculars. Most binoculars are going to have what's called a diopter adjustment. And this is used if you have basically different vision in your two eyes. So if one eye is a little better or worse than the other, what it allows you to do is adjust the focus in each of the barrels independently. So typically it's on the right side over here. You look through, you sort of close one eye, you look through the other, adjust the focus, and then close the other eye. And then you can adjust the diopter to either increase or decrease the magnification until you get a clear picture. Once you do that, the binoculars are really adjusted to you. They are now set to your particular vision. And it's going to make it a lot easier, especially if you're birding for a long time period and you start to get eye strain. So it may not be something noticeable at first because your eyes are pretty good at adjusting. But if you're out birding for a full day, you will notice a difference if you adjust the diopter. And most binoculars will have this. Some of them now have it in the center focus wheel. Some of them have them on the eyepiece, so you just have to see what you're looking at. The other piece that a lot of people don't realize is that most binoculars have eye cups that are adjustable. They can be folded or twisted down to accommodate binoculars, or sorry, eyepiece. So again, if you see here, you can twist them down. Probably not a great demo, especially because I'm probably tiny. But you can adjust them up and down. And the idea is that you want to maintain about 15 to 18 millimeter distance between your eyes and the lens. And so if you wear glasses, you want to twist that those eye cups down and basically have the lens right up to your glasses. If you're not wearing glasses, you can twist that eye cups up and it provides a little bit more shading and maintains that distance. So these are little things, especially if you start, borrowing binoculars from people. Check and see, do they have the eye cups twisted down? Are they twisted up? What do you need to do to magnify things or to fit them to your ability? There are, if you start looking again in binocular reviews, they do actually talk about the different levels of eye cups and how comfortable they are. There's some really great reviews out there that, there's 30 people that are trying these different binoculars, some people with glasses, some people without, and they really give a good feel of what's comfortable for people. A couple other features that you'll see, just based on the design of the binoculars, some of them have different degrees of field of view, which tells you basically how much you're able to see. Typically, higher magnification narrows the field of view. You're looking closer, but you don't get to see as much. Field of view is really good, especially if you're scanning for, small little active birds. The more that you can actually see, the more field of view you can see, the better your chances are of actually tracking the bird that you're looking for. So keep your eyes out for that. One that's important to me is the close focus range. So some binoculars can focus down, so you can be about 4 feet away, 6 feet away, and they'll actually function. Others, you just can't get that level of close focus. A lot of people are using binoculars now for butterfly identification or other insect identification. And with those, you can actually get pretty close. And so a close focus range is something that might matter to you. If you think you're going to become a butterfly watcher or a dragonfly watcher or a native bee watcher like me, then thinking about that close focus is actually really important. A few other things, and it's just too much to think about right away. How durable are the binoculars? Are they waterproof? Most of them are waterproof, but especially if you're getting into the cheaper range, they may not be as durable. They may not have as good of waterproofing. And you also want to consider what the warranty is. Some binoculars, like the Nikons that I use, have lifetime warranties, and they're sometimes no fault warranties, which means that if you put it on the hood of your car and forget about it and drive off, and it bounces across the ground, you can actually send it in and they'll repair it. So there's some really good warranties in a lot of the optic companies. So probably the most important thing when you're looking at binoculars is how much can you spend? Binoculars and all optics have a pretty crazy range. You can get pretty good binoculars for around $100. You can get amazing binoculars for several $1,000s. I personally haven't even looked through $1,000 binoculars because I don't want to see what that looks like. It's like flying. Once you see what the best is, it's hard to go back. But it can be kind of weird because I'm pretty happy with my binoculars, which are, I think they were $400 binoculars. So what do you get for that extra money? Typically, they have better glass. So they actually use a higher quality glass, which lets in more light, tends to give a clearer focus. So you get crisper images. A lot of times you have more durability. and you might end up with better warranties. And I'll say the top end, you can get stuff, mid-range is you can get some good binoculars. The cheaper ones, especially the cheapest, they tend to be poor images, especially in low light. And they're often easier to damage. They just aren't quite as durable, or maybe they only have a 2-year warranty instead of a lifetime warranty. So you can really get, I think, good binoculars in the $200 to $400 range. I'd be curious if anybody who's on the meeting right now, if you have binoculars that you really like, if you drop that in the chat, tell us what they are and, ballpark how expensive they are. The ones that I have are Nikon Monarchs. They're the Monarch 7s. They're about $400. So they were a step up. We started with Monarch 5s that were closer to like $250 or $300. But there's some really good ones out there at that price point. The warning, of course, is that if you come into it thinking you want to spend 20 bucks or 50 bucks, you're probably going to get disappointed pretty quickly. You're probably going to outgrow those binoculars pretty fast. So a lot of times you want to think about what you can afford at a good range, or look for, used market or something like that. The real question is what are you willing to spend? Are you willing to go up to the full Scrooge McDuck money bags, $1,000 binoculars, or do you want to keep things a little bit clear, a little bit more reasonable? So the general advice, try before you buy. This is obviously difficult in COVID times, and it's also a little bit difficult living in El Paso because we don't have a great sports optics store. The store that I've seen that has the best selection is Cabela's, up in the upper, I guess, far west side now. They've got a good range of binoculars. They let you try them so you can actually, see the fit. You can check the magnification. You can play with the diopter. Again, I don't know if you can do that during COVID times, but certainly try them out. It's good to, try something before you do buy them. Do some research online. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Audubon, Birdwatchers Digest, they do pretty extensive reviews pretty frequently. And they'll tell you more than you want to know. Once you do get binoculars, spend some time messing with the diopters, spend some time playing around with the eye cups, so that they really are personalized to you. And then also practice using them, which I know sounds stupid, but a lot of times what we see is people will look at a bird and then they have their binoculars, but they look down at their binoculars and then they look up and they can't find the bird again. So something just as simple as looking at the bird, don't change your eyes, practice bringing the binoculars up and keeping your eye on the bird can make a big difference with your ability and your happiness birding. There's a couple good online places. Red Start Birding has a lot of optics. It's actually run by people who know about birds and bird watching, so it's a good source for information. And then BH Photo Video has a ton of options as well, and both optics and cameras and all sorts of good stuff. All right, I guess I'll keep plugging on and do questions at the end. I did just want to mention spotting scopes. They're kind of next level for birding, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but just wanted to mention them because they are can be an important tool. They typically have a lot higher magnification. So if you're looking at birds far away, so if you go out to Rio Bosque where this picture was taken and you're trying to identify the ducks that are 300 yards away, and if you take one more step, they're all going to fly away. Something like a spotting scope is really going to be useful because you can stay further away where the birds are comfortable and you can still get a good look at them. They work well for, spotting scopes are good for shorebirds. They can be good for raptors, but they're pretty heavy. So you don't necessarily want to haul them around every time you go hiking. And they have less freedom of movement. So you can think, a bird flies by, if you have binoculars, you can turn right away. If you have a spotting scope, you may have to pick it up, move it over. You may have to step to a different side. You have to be comfortable with how it moves. they just don't work quite as well for smaller birds or for more active birds. So those are some of the pros and cons. The magnification is what's really exciting about them. They typically range from either, and they have a zoom, which most binoculars don't. And so they typically zoom from 20x to 60x, or maybe 20x to 80x. And if you remember the binoculars, you're looking more at 7 to 10x. So you're looking at doubling to quintupling or octupling your magnification by using spotting scopes. So that's the real draw for them. They tend to have a pretty large lens diameter, which is this part down here. The larger they are, the more light that gets let in again. But the bigger they are, also the heavier they are, so they can be harder to move around. They also could be a little bit more expensive. There's a bunch of options out there. Again, typically people aim for around an 80 millimeter objective. The other thing that a lot of people, sort of the other option that you get, is whether you want straight, like this one here, or angled eyepieces. Straight can be easier for beginners because it's just a more straightforward process. Angled is a little bit easier on the neck. There's a little bit more ability to use it in different heights with different people. Typically better for digiscoping, which is when you hold your phone camera up to the lens to try to get a good picture. This actually is interesting. This is the same spotting scope. It's just available in either an angled or a straight model. So you can really, see what you want with a lot of them. Price is also a big player here. Decent models, you're looking at more like $250. There's good ones in the $400 to $600 option. Top of the line are like $3,000 to $5,000. Again, I think we've used one in that range when we were on a birding trip, and it was pretty sweet. Ours is definitely not to that level. The other thing that you need is a tripod, a sturdy tripod that's not going to fall over in a gust of wind or if somebody knocks into it. So you're also looking, on top of the buying a spotting scope, you're also looking at a tripod for another $100 to $900. So this is why most birders, especially if they're beginning, don't have spotting scopes. But if you really get into it, if you want to figure out which of the wintering gulls is something other than a ring-billed gull, a spotting scope is really the way to go. So great to have, but not as important as binoculars, especially when you're getting started. Okay, so now you have the birds in sight, you have them magnified, you're looking at features. The next thing you need is your field guide. So a couple things about field guides in general. So they're ordered taxonomically. Typically the first half is the non-perching birds, the non-passerines. And the order is generally things like water birds, then raptors, then shorebirds, then hummingbirds and woodpeckers. And they usually end with sparrows. Well, the nice thing about this is that similar birds are next to each other. So this is that taxonomy piece from the bird identification talk. Can you figure out what general type of bird you're looking at? Because once you know you're looking at a shorebird, you can go to the shorebird section and they're all going to be pretty close to each other. So it narrows the amount of flipping that you have to do. I'll mention it later, but just to point it out again, or point it out now, you do want to spend time becoming familiar with your field guide, seeing how it's organized, trying to figure out where the different sections are so that you can start to get better at flipping to the right section when you're trying to identify something. So again, I'll mention that again in a minute. The meat of a field guide, or I guess for me as a vegetarian, the roasted cauliflower of the field guide, is the species account. So that's where you're going to get the information that's going to help you with the bird identification. So if you remember back to how do you identify a bird, the things that are important are the range, and that's given in the maps that you can see down here. The seasonality, so what's the breeding range? What's the winter range? Are they present year round? that's given by different colors in the map. Habitat, so they'll often describe something here. It talks about found in brushy open habitats in suburbs. So what kind of habitat are you looking at? Something about behavior. So, wings produce a light, airy whistling on takeoff. So what's the behavior of these birds like? What's the size and shape? So you can see up here are the measurements: length, wingspan, weight, males bigger than females for the mourning dove. It'll also give you the color patterns, which are the field marks. So I know it's probably too small to see, but it talks about a slender body or a pale bluish orbital ring, a striking white patch on the white-winged dove. And they'll also usually describe voice. So it talks about a rhythmic hooting, hee-hee, poo-poo. I did not think I was going to do that, which is why that was not practiced whatsoever. But it does give you an idea of sort of the call that they might have. So each of these accounts should give you, a pretty good idea of what you're actually looking for in these pictures. The other thing that most field guides have is some really good introductory information. So the first, 20 to 30 pages of the field guide is going to talk about how to identify a bird, how to use that particular field guide. Some of them have information about conservation. Some of them have information about different habitat types. But it's really worth reading, and that's certainly something I did not do initially, but there's a lot of good information that isn't just what bird are you looking at. So some of the different types of guides out there, and I will say these are actually all guidebooks that I own, well, my wife and I own. So there's guidebooks that are basically the entire US. And then of course I realized the Crossley guide is just Eastern birds, but this is basically a whole North American field guide. And they have different degrees of coverage. So there's a Peterson's first guide that's not going to have all of the birds out there. The Sibley guide is pretty good size, actually. Brought it as a prop. This is the Sibley first edition. You can see it's a pretty hefty book. It covers 700 to 800 species of birds in North America. But these are pretty heavy. They're not necessarily something you want to carry around in the field with you. And so there are books that are more location specific. So it could be something like, the Birder's Guide to the Rio Grande Valley. So focused on just birds you're going to see down in South Texas. Bird books for different countries, birds of southeastern Arizona. There's also there's a Sibley Eastern and a Sibley Western. There's a lot of bird books that take that guide and divide it in half. The advantage is that they tend to be smaller and lighter, so they're easier to stick in your pocket. The disadvantage is you may miss out on some birds. So especially where we are, and frigate birds, right? Like if you had a guide to the Western US, you may not have frigate birds, and when one comes in, you'd be confused. So there's definitely trade-offs. I know some people, I've fielded questions asking like, what's the best field guide to the birds of El Paso? And the question is really, do you want just birds that are that have been seen in El Paso before? Do you want birds from the Western US? What if you go to Santa Fe? What if you go to Southeastern Arizona? A guide that's specific to El Paso isn't going to cut it at that point. Are you going to go back east and do some birding there? So you have to just think about where you're going to want a bird, and do you want to keep the bird guide with you when you go someplace. But you can see that bottom one of the birds of southeastern Arizona, that's a much smaller book. That's a book that you can, throw in your pocket while you're out birding. There's taxon specific guides. So this is when you start getting seriously into the bird nerd side of things. So there's books that are specifically about raptors. So this one hawks from every angle. You see them from the top, the bottom, the side, perched, soaring, etc. There's entire books on sparrows, on hummingbirds, on warblers, shorebirds, gulls, like especially the more difficult birds. There's probably a guide specifically to them. Most of the time we don't take these out in the field with us. We might, winter is a good time for sparrows where we are. So maybe, if we're going to grasslands, a grassy grassland type area in the winter, maybe we'll bring the sparrow guide with us. If we know we're, going out someplace where there might be a lot of raptors, maybe we'll bring a hawk guide with us. But typically these are more pleasure reading in the evening type guides. There's bird finding guides. So these basically tell you where to go to find birds, not necessarily how to identify them once you get there. There's a New Mexico guide. Ours is a 2002 edition. I don't know if there's a newer one out there, but there's those as well. So if you're really thinking, you know, I want to go on a trip, I want to know where to find the birds when I go on a trip, these books exist as well. When you start getting into guides, one of the first decisions you have to make is whether you want a guide that uses illustrations or a guide that uses photos. And you can see some of the differences here. This is the Sibley guide with drawings versus the Smithsonian guide, which uses pictures. A lot of times they're pretty equivalent. It doesn't give you too much of a difference. But one of the things that I've seen is that field guides with drawings are actually recommended for beginning birders. And the reason for that is that the artist who's drawing that particular bird is basically taking the range of variation that exists within a particular bird and kind of averaging it. So trying to figure out, you know, what's an average common yellowthroat look like? When you're doing a picture, the person who puts the book together can look through all the pictures of birds and try to choose the one that's most representative, but you're really looking at that particular individual. You're not looking at that compilation of all the individuals that are out there. Of course, one option is just buy one of each and compare. That's obviously an option as well. A lot of it's personal preference. And again, this is a, you know, try before you buy type thing. So some general recommendations. Consider where you're going to be using the field guide. What's the size? What's the weight? Is it something that you want to carry with you, or is it something that you're going to leave in the car? Because if that's your only guide and it's too big and you leave it in the car, then it's not going to be helpful. How much traveling are you going to do with that guide? What scope do you need? Do you need Western US? Do you need entire US? Do you need New Mexico only? Look at the options. If you're able to go in person, you can go to, you know, Barnes and Noble, check out Amazon. Red Start Birding again has things. You can also ask around to see what people use. If you can, ask to see what they're using and flip through it and see what you think. Read through the guide, become familiar with it. And then the advice that we certainly had to follow was clear off an entire shelf because you're going to fill it up with bird books pretty soon. We've got actually like a double shelf worth of bird books. The ones I showed were only a section of what we actually have. Okay, or if you don't want to do guide or you want to do field guide and modern technology, you can look at birding apps, which is basically most of what I use these days. So these are programs, you know, apps that you can download to your smartphone. Most of them are available for both iOS and Android, although there might be, you know, some newer ones or more niche ones that are just for one or the other. The Pro, obviously, it's easy to carry, right? So field guide right there. They include sounds, which is really cool. You can actually listen to the calls of most of these birds. And some of them actually walk you through identification. And I'll show you some examples of that. That's pretty cool. Some of the cons, though, if you don't really know what you're looking for, I still find field guides to be easier to use. If you know that it's a sparrow and it's got some stripes, it's a lot easier just to go to the sparrow section of the field guide and flip through until you find which one matches. The apps are a little bit tougher to use. They can drain your battery. I've had a lot of issues with batteries on older phones in particular, where you're trying to use your phone while you're out birding and it dies. And they can use a lot of storage. Most of them are somewhere around 200 megabytes to 500 megabytes of storage. One of the big ones actually is almost 2 gigabytes of storage. So again, depending on your phone, you may not have that much capacity. All right, so we're basically going to walk you through some of the ones that I have. And there's some that are essentially just a basic, it's a digital version of a field guide. So the Peterson Field Guide app, it looks almost exactly like a regular field guide. You can browse by groups of birds. Once you choose one, you have these panels. So this is a panel that shows 4 hummingbirds species next to each other. You can click up here for maps, and it'll take you to the maps, and you can see maps for all of these. Again, the importance of range, knowing what should be in the area. And you can click on the description, and it gives you the map or the verbal description, the text description there. So really similar to what you would have if you just had a field guide. And I use this app a lot when it's a bird, especially, a sparrow or a shorebird or a flycatcher, that I'm just not really sure which one it is. And it's really nice to get that panel of the 3 or 4 similar ones on the screen at the same time, and then be able to go into more detail. You can get more features. So Sibley has an app. Some of the features that are nice with this one, it has, well, one thing to notice, you can actually set your location. I always set New Mexico because we're essentially New Mexico. I don't really care what's happening in East Texas as far as bird options. But when you set your location, if you go in and browse the birds, it's only going to show you the birds that are expected in that particular location. So one of the challenges, if you remember from the bird identification talk, was narrowing the field. We have 750 species of birds. We want to get it to as few as possible that you're trying to decide about. So being able to set the location is really helpful for that. You can basically click on alphabetic index or taxonomic index, and you can scroll through. So just looking alphabetically through all the birds. But you can also search, which is really handy. So you can search for hummingbird, and now it's showing you the different hummingbirds that are available. And then you can click on the one you're interested in, and you basically have the species account from the field guide on the screen. I will say one of the reasons that I like the Peterson app is I don't find this particular user face, this list of species. It has the thumbnail, but that's still pretty tough to use. It doesn't really give you that side-by-side comparison that you get with a field guide. But if you know what the options are, so as you get more advanced, you can search in and start to find the bird. This is where things get really cool. They have the calls. So you can actually hear chase calls, flight display calls. Some birds have a bunch of different calls available. If they don't have a lot of calls, it might be a simpler piece. And then one thing the Sibley app has that's really nice is you can do a side-by-side comparison. So you can actually put the 2 things that you're deciding between on the screen and sort of flip through it. All right, even more advanced, iBird Pro. So this is the app that's like 2 gigabytes. And I will say Sibley in this, they're probably $15 to $20, which is cheaper than a paper field guide, but freaks people out with apps. We want apps to be cheap. We've been conditioned to like $1 is expensive for an app, but it does cost a little bit. But if you look now, if you search, it gives you a ton of options. Birds around me, time of day, location, shape, backyard feeder, what type of feeder, family, abundance, like just a crazy amount of information. And you can see here with no filter, 950 birds available through this app. I went through and just added New Mexico and lakes, rivers, and ponds, and it dropped it down to 80. So 80 is obviously a lot, but you can see, if you know a shape, if you know colors, you can start to narrow things down further. So again, narrow how many birds you have to look through to figure out which one you're actually looking at. Within the app, if you're trying to decide, do you want illustrations or photos, an app is a great way. This app is a great way to do both. It has illustrations. All the field marks are nicely labeled. You can actually turn those on and off, which is kind of fun. But you can also look at pictures. So you can see pictures of the birds at the same place that you're looking at the illustrations of the birds. This one has the cinnamon teal. There's 12 pictures. Some have more, some have less, depends. One of the other cool things, you can click similar and it'll show you the birds that are commonly misidentified as that one. So if you're looking at what you think is a cinnamon teal, the things you should be considering are blue-winged teal and ruddy duck. So again, You don't have to look at all the ducks in the world. Now you've got 3 species to compare. It also has calls. You can see this one has the spectrograms, has descriptions, so pretty detailed calls. And it also has sort of identification terminology. All this information is why it's a 2 GB program. It has all of that in the program itself. This is a really cool one called Merlin. And this one it's designed by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and it's really designed to help people narrow the field based on what's been seen in the area recently. So this app is free, which is also cool. And it covers a good portion of the US, of the world actually, and you can download different packs. So you can download the Texas pack and it's 500 megabytes, and you can download the Arizona and New Mexico app. You can download I think there's like an Indonesian pack if you want to know what the birds in Indonesia look like. And you can do bird ID. It'll actually do photo ID. If you take a picture of something, it'll try to identify it as like a photo matching technology. And you can also just explore birds, use it kind of as a normal field guide. But I'm going to focus on the start bird ID part. And it asks you again, what are these key parts of bird identification? So where are you? What's your habitat? You can click current location. You can choose a map. Those locations that are listed there are the ones that I had used it for. So you could be using it currently, or you could use it to try to identify something you saw a year ago on a trip. So where did you see the bird? When did you see the bird? Seasonality is really important. What size was the bird? And on this, you can see it's very comparative. So, you know, is it the size of a goose? Is it the size of a sparrow? Is it somewhere in between? What were the main colors? And again, these are main colors, not looking at all the subtlety. You can select between 1 to 3. I just chose gray. And then you can look at the behavior. So again, all these features that we talked about for bird identification, it walks you through these steps. Is it eating at a feeder? Is it swimming? Is it soaring? Is it on a fence? And then once you've answered the 5 questions, you click the button, it thinks, and then it gives you options. And you can scroll through. They're essentially ranked based on how likely it is, based off of the eBird reports in the area. The top one was collared dove, then mourning dove, then white-winged dove. You can't really see it here, but you can actually scroll to the side and there's more pictures of it. There's the call, you can listen to the call. It has the description. It gives you basically all you need to try to identify which of these birds you're looking at. So it's pretty awesome. You can really refine things a lot. And if you have a picture, you can throw the picture in and it can try to identify it that way. Okay, I mentioned that there are field guides that help you find birds. There's an app that helps you find birds, of course. It's called Bird's Eye. You can search in a couple different ways. This is the home screen. You can search for nearby birds. So if you're just wondering like what's been seen around me, you can search that way. You can also search by a particular bird. Where has a greater white-fronted goose been seen around me? If you click nearby, this is the screen that you get. You can actually filter it different ways. You can set how far away, how recent, so you can play around with it that way. But then it shows you what's been seen. The red line is current. The red dot is when the bird was seen. And then if you click on it, so you think, man, cinnamon teal, those cinnamon teal looked awesome. I want to know where to go. You can click on that and it shows you the spots that they've been reported. So this is Ascaridae. There's Rio Bosque, there's Keystone, Crossroads Pond, and that's probably La Estancia. So here are some of the locations. You can actually get directions directly to it. And if you click on it, so let's say you click on Keystone, it'll also show you all the birds that have been reported there. So you can see, you know, if I'm going to Keystone, what am I likely to see based on the eBird sightings? I use this app a ton when I'm trying to figure out what's been seen, or if you're traveling somewhere. Let's say you want to go to Bosque del Apache and you want to know if the cranes are still there. You can open this up and see if cranes have been reported or when they were last reported. And I'm not going to go into this because that's a whole other presentation, but there's also an app for recording observations. This is eBird, which is basically the gold standard for community science with birds these days. You can start a checklist, put in a location. It'll tell you likely species based on what's been reported in the area. A red dot means it hasn't been reported, but is possible. The yellow half circle is it's been reported, but not recently. And then the non-circles means that they're common in that area. So good for recording information, but also for seeing what's in the area. So the recommendations, basically, they're awesome. You should play with them. Try the free ones, try Merlin. Audubon actually has an app that I think is free, but like I've got 5 or 6 field guides on my phone with me at all times. So I don't really take field guides out in the field anymore because it's all in my pocket. And especially with Merlin and some of those, you can really identify stuff as well. Like I said, websites, I knew I was running out of time, so here are some websites. There's some really great ones out there, not to do too much of a short shift to these. All About Birds is a Cornell Lab of Ornithology. There's a lot of, again, it's basically bird identification, so all the species accounts. It pulls up eBird maps. It puts a lot of information into one place. eBird has a lot of really good info. And then to plug our groups, we have Facebook presence. So we have El Paso Audubon, which is really us serving information to you. But there's also an El Paso Audubon group. So facebook.com/El Paso Audubon group. You can post pictures of birds and ask questions about them. We've all been enjoying each other's birds at the feeders in the snow, learning about what's been seen, all sorts of good stuff. So a good chance to use that community. And that's it. So things are looking up. Technology is great. We've got good, inexpensive binoculars. We've got great field guides. We've got great apps and websites. There's a ton of reviews out there for helping you answer, like find anything, answer any questions that you might have about them. And with all of these, you can really make your birding experience just wonderful. You can see the birds well, you can identify them, you can learn about them. It's a great time to be a birder. And with that, I will take a drink of water and answer any questions that anybody has.
That was great, Kevin. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott.
Kevin, I do have a request.
Yes.
Can you repeat those bird calls you did earlier again?
That's let me pull it up on the app and then I'll do it. That's yet another talk, is how to learn bird calls. Any other questions?
Kevin, let me say that you had a question earlier about field guides of El Paso, and we do have the checklist for El Paso County and adjacent areas that's put out, and I think we can find some copies of that if someone wants them. I find it very helpful to have the what season of the year the birds are here and what you might see and how common it is.
Yeah, that's a great resource. I think there's a PDF of it floating around the internet somewhere. I keep seeing it pop up, and I don't think it's hosted on our site, so we need to find it and put it on our site, or track down hard copies for people who want the hard copies.
Yeah.
Are there any app users in the group? Anyone have any favorites? I gotta say, it's been, you can tell I'm a big fan of the apps. It just makes life a lot easier. They do, you know, a field guide is still great when you're flipping through, but and they're just getting to be a lot of really cool information. The calls, the ability to filter, the smart search, where you can really say, you know, what's this bird at this location doing this thing, and have only 10 things to choose from. It's pretty nice.
I just downloaded the Merlin app and I
Mhm.
put in my location and it tells me likely birds I'll see there today.
There you go. Sometimes I don't know what its range is, so you know it may not be a backyard bird, but yeah, it'll tell you what's in the area. And a lot of those are built off of eBird observations, so people who are actually out observing birds and submitting what they see to the database, because then it turns around and uses that to tell you what's likely to be seen, and also pulls in some of the information like Eddie was talking about with bar charts and sort of the occurrence. So, you know, something that is really only a summer bird, it's not going to suggest it for you, but something that is a winter bird, it will suggest it.
Kevin, I've been using the Merlin bird app, and one nice feature I like is it allows you to compile a life list. Every time you have a new bird, you identify it. It says, you know, it adds it to your life list and kind of gives you a little tally of the species you found.
Yeah, that's a nice feature with it, and I think it can connect it to your eBird account if you do eBird also, or it can keep it internal to the program.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. Life lists are, for me anyway, a very addictive thing. I'm definitely I'm a lister, so caution if you're a lister. Yeah, Merlin's great. When Vic and I went to Belize a few years ago, the bird guides were using Merlin as essentially the birding app, and just not going through all the steps of identify a bird, but going through that explore birds option, because it's one of the few that were available for the area, and they're really expanding their spatial coverage of birds. So it's definitely a cool one. And I think it's also a web, you can do all the same stuff through the web, I believe. And I don't know if it's through Merlin or if it's through All About Birds and then you find it that way. Well, all right, it is 8 o'clock. I'm happy to answer any more questions, but if there are no more questions, then I think we can end the meeting.
Again, thank you, Kevin. And
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks so
That was
much,
very
Kevin.
good. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
thank you
you,
to
Kevin.
everybody
That was
who
great.
joined in and took part in this. We hope to see you again next month for our next presentation. So take care, everyone. Stay healthy.
All right. Good night.
So long.
Good night.
Thank you, Kevin.
You're welcome.